Hey, all right. Hello, and welcome to another very geeky episode of Omen Publications from Comics to Screen. I am your host, Michael Nunley, and on this show, I talk about movies, TV, and comics and how they correlate with one another through comparison. Basically, if it has to do with comics and either television or film, then it belongs on this show. But as always, you should know that I'm going to spoil the crap out of these comics, the films, and television shows that I cover as I comparatively go through them. So, with that out of the way, let's dive into episode two. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the 1992 goth classic, The Crow, and the two stories and five comics it's based on, namely the Caliber Presents #1 story, Inertia, and the Caliber Christmas story, Atmosphere, as well as the Crow books 1 through 5, Pain, Fear, Irony, Despair, and Death. Let's talk about some of the surface stuff that's going to be a little different here. In the movie, The Crow with Eric leads him to each of his victims, but in the comics, Eric brutally interrogates several people in order to find out where everyone is. And those characters are missing from the film or amalgamated into other characters. Also, in the film, Eric kills his victims in a manner befitting their sins: knives with Tintin, fire with T-Bird, and so on. He also kills them in the order that they raped Shelley, but there is no such poetic justice in the comics, save for perhaps how Funboy is killed with the morphine he's addicted to. Also in the comics, it is T-Bird that is the big man in Detroit and not Top Dollar, though Top Dollar does have some men under him. Top Dollar, however, is nothing like the quasi-ancestral cokehead you see in the film. Top Dollar on the comics was a high-level drug dealer, and he definitely had men under him, so he had some power, but he wasn't snorting the coke, he was weighing it out. But I will be talking about some of the differences in this episode, so keep watching until the end to get it all. The movie starts out on Devil's Night, not long after what happened to Eric and Shelley at the hands of T-Bird and his gang. But a couple of things have changed right from the start. First, and this is really fairly minor, the comic does not mention Devil's Night at all. But I think it's a nice addition to the film, as it is a traditional arson and vandalism night in Detroit, and that is where the comic is set. The big changes in that first few minutes are that Eric and Shelley were not killed in their apartment. They were killed on the outskirts of town on an old farm road. Next is that Shelley was the one who died first that night and not Eric. But I will elaborate on that a bit more in just a little bit. The next big change is that Shelley asked Officer Albrecht to tell Eric to take care of Sarah, because in the movie, Sarah was close with Shelley and by extension, Eric. Number one, Sarah's name is Sherry in the comic, and Shelley and Eric had no previous relationship with her. Eric did not meet her until he came back from the dead. Also, Eric was trying to wrap things up because he knew that he would be going back to Shelley soon. He left a note for Officer Albrecht asking him to look out for Sherry, aka Sarah. So they made the request to look out for Sarah happen the night of their death instead of later on, and showed Sarah going to their graves and getting a hot dog from Officer Albrecht to kind of quickly establish these non-canonical relationships. They also amalgamated Captain Hook and Officer Albrecht from the comics with the Ernie Hudson character. And truth be told, I actually like Hudson's character more than either of these characters on their own in the comics. But technically speaking, it was Captain Hook who was there the night that Eric and Shelley were murdered, not Albrecht. The next bit with Eric breaking out of his grave was actually kind of cool. They didn't show that in the comics, and it was rather clever to have his shirt and jacket cut down the back. This is common practice in funeral homes, and it makes the dead easier to dress, with it being a more looser in the back there. Another thing they didn't show in the comics that they did in the movie was Eric finding shoes and clothes. He's always just dressed in the comic. They never even bring it up. But he does put his makeup on, and that happens in the next scene. But then, once back in his and Shelley's old apartment, Eric relives the night that he and Shelley were murdered by T-Bird and his gang. It was rewritten in more ways than one. Shelley and Eric were not fighting housing eviction or poor living conditions, and T-Bird did not come to scare off anyone else who might have such ideas. In the comics, Eric and Shelley's car broke down on the wrong country road at the wrong time, and T-Bird and his gang came across them randomly while driving around smoking crack. To say that we see the tame version of what happened in the movie is is definitely an understatement. Check this out. The abridged version is like this. While out on that old country road trying to fix their broken car, Eric and Shelley get attacked by T-Bird and his gang, who, as I mentioned, are all high on crack. Eric tries nicely to get them to back off and leave him and Shelley alone. But when they start harassing Shelley in the locked car, Eric gets pissed and screams at them to get away from her. But T-Bird, who is just itching for a chance to kill Eric, shoots Eric not once but twice in the head at close range for begging. But somehow, and I have no idea what kind of bullet or pussy-ass gun could possibly be that weak, Eric survives these two shots to the head, one of which was at close range, as I mentioned. That just, I mean, I don't get that part, but that's what happened. He lays there on the road helplessly and crying as T-Bird and his gang raped, beat, and killed Shelley in the field. Shelley screamed the entire time, and Tom Tom kicked her in the face over and over again to get her to stop, but she doesn't stop. T-Bird pushes Tom Tom aside and just shoots Shelley in the head, splattering blood all over Tom Tom. This is where shit gets really sick. That's when Fun Boy steps up to have sex with Shelley's corpse. And even those with him said that was sick. In fact, while he's sitting there fucking her corpse, everybody else just gets in the car and leaves. They're like, yeah, we don't want no part of that shit. So, I mean, the event itself, as you can tell, is considerably more brutal. And Fun Boy is revealed to be a truly sick fuck. The next part in the comic leads to another change from the comics to the film. In the movie, Officer Albrecht says that he stayed behind as Shelley suffered through 30 hours of pain before dying. But just as I described, Shelley was long dead in the comics, and while it does not say anything about the length of time that Eric suffered in the hospital through multiple surgeries with what amounts to like the Keystone Cops of doctors, it is in fact Eric who was watched over by Captain Hook. And even then, like I said, it was Captain Hook and not Officer Albrecht. So that whole thing was kind of switched around, and there is no specific mention of 30 hours. Just that it happened. So I don't know why they chose 30 hours specifically or why that is that way, but whatever. It works nicely to have a nice time cap on it for when he gives that all to Top Dollar, all that pain. So I mean that's probably, I'm guessing, why they put a cap on it, but I'm not sure why they chose 30 specifically. Anyway, in the comics, there's a scene that I believe was Eric's experience after he died. Eric is sitting on a train, which I assume would take him to heaven or hell, though it is not specified. But there is a ticket taker with a skull for a face that I'm pretty sure is some version of Charon, aka the ferryman. While Eric is on the train looking out the window, he witnesses a beautiful horse running free in the field, only to get stuck in some barbed wire fencing and get cut up pretty badly, and this terribly traumatizes Eric. If you ask me, I say that it is kind of like a dream sequence, and the beautiful horse getting caught in the barbed wire is a dreamlike metaphor for what happened to Shelley. Immediately following this experience, the ticket taker asks Eric for his ticket, and the crow sitting on the bench right in front of him says, well, now if you combine this with the crow waking Eric up from death and telling him that he has responsibilities, like what happens in the comics, then it tells me that the ticket taker and the crow were wanting Eric to acknowledge that something terrible had happened and that needed to be set right. What's more, Eric was the one who would need to set those things right. The movie avoids the religious overtones of the comic, and in my opinion, it loses something in the translation, and part of who and what Eric Draven, aka the Crow, was and did. Check this out. In the comic, when contemplating his immortal soul, Eric believes that there is a more than one way to purify the soul, to gain absolution, redemption, and salvation. He was talking about avoiding the trappings of Christianity as a system and finding another way to heaven without Christ, a priest, or a church. That key to heaven that he was talking about was to come back and set things right by killing off the scum that is T-Bird and his gang. And when I say scum, boy, do I fucking mean it. The movie doesn't even gloss over what pieces of shit these guys really are. I mean, it would take me a while to go into it. Let's just say these guys are messed up. They are cruel. They are just, I don't know how else to say it. They're pieces of shit. However, before you think a killing spree like that sounds too crazy to amount to salvation, consider how God uses Samson to take out the Philistines in Judges. What's more is that in both cases, Samson and Eric were used by God as his hand of vengeance and were given inhuman abilities to accomplish it. You know, in the comic, Eric says that he has allies in heaven. I believe those allies to be God himself and Shelley, and that he did go to heaven in the end despite not being a Christian. At the very least, I think that is what James O'Barr is implying at the end of the comic. But back to Eric putting on his makeup. After the memory of what had happened a year earlier hit him like a ton of bricks, and then reliving that string of memories with Shelley, Eric is filled with rage. The movie subtly shows the tragedy mask hanging on Shelley's vanity, and Eric clearly models his makeup after that tragedy mask. But just as a little insight there from the comics, Shelley got the comedy tragedy mask for the apartment because she thought they were very nice. And Eric actually teased her about it at the time, but here he is choosing one of Shelley's masks as his new face. I think that the reason for this was it was a way to carry a piece of Shelley with him, even if it was just symbolic like that. This is all happening while Eric is seeing flashbacks of moments with Shelley, and that is actually something that's right out of the comics. Not those particular scenes, mind you, but Eric using memories of Shelley and him together as fuel for his rage is a reoccurring thing in the comics. The Crow constantly tries to get Eric to stop reliving these moments because of how painful they are. But Eric doesn't listen. This is something that often happens before he actually goes out to kill again, and that is why I call it, he's using it as fuel for his rage. Next, we see Tintin at Gideon's get rid of a couple of gold rings. While this exact scene did not happen in the comics, it is established in the comics that Tintin would often go to Gideon's pawn shop with jewelry that he had taken from the people he had killed or robbed. In fact, Eric finds out while he is looking for the engagement ring that he gave Shelley that Tintin had taken it to Gideon's pawn shop, and that is what actually leads Eric there. The first one of top dollar guys that the Crow leads Eric to in the movie is Tintin, so that was kind of fitting. And he does this just after he leaves Gideon's pawn shop. In the comics, Tintin had just come from wasting a couple of guys, one of whom thought he was Tintin's friend. And let's not forget the old lady carrying her groceries down the street that he wasted just to check out his new gun. So when Tintin says that murder is fun and easy, and that is very in character for Tintin, even if he doesn't actually say that in the comics. This guy is so used to killing it does not even faze him anymore. And in the comics, Tintin has no knife fixation either. And he shot Eric in the head when they met him in the alleyway. But Eric had a gun too and blasted off a piece of Tintin's forearm, forcing Tintin to drop his gun. In both the film and the comics, Eric reminds Tintin about that night with Shelley. But in the comics, rather than piercing him with a knife in all of his major organs, Eric just puts a gun under his chin and blows Tintin's brains up into the air when he's done. There's one thing in the movie worth noting here. When the police are at the crime scene in the movie hauling out Tintin's body, they see a crow painted in blood on the wall. There was no crow painted on the wall with blood in the comics, but Eric did cut himself with a straight razor as a means of dealing with his pain and loss. He used the blood to draw the cat in the hat on the wall in the comics, which was a little silly, but in this case, I definitely think doing the crow on the wall was much cooler. However, considering the movie, I think it's much more likely that in the movie, Eric would have used Tintin's blood to make the crow rather than his own. However, he does cut himself in the film too, but the scenes were removed. You'll notice that Eric suddenly shows up in the film and he's got black tape wrapped around his arms and on his body. This was actually to cover up the wounds he had inflicted on himself. Just as a bit of insight into why Eric would be a cutter, and another warning that this show is not for kids. So to the adults, cutting, while harming the body, works as an emotional release for the cutter. I know this from personal experience. It's like releasing the pressure valve when emotions are boiling over. Psychologically speaking, cutting is undealt with pain attempting to resurface and be dealt with in any way it can. I believe that something similar is going on with Eric's use of morphine in the comics as well. Eric simultaneously needs his pain for rage fuel, and the pain is also too much for him to bear. So cutting and using morphine releases that pressure valve. I bring this up because this is a side of Eric that is not explored in the film and is, in my opinion, essential to understanding the character. The next scene establishes Sarah as Darla's daughter, as well as Darla, aka Sandy, in the comics, and Funboy's relationship. But again, this is not how it went down in the comics. When we first meet Sarah, aka Sherry, in the comics, she is sitting outside of the stairs of Funboy's apartment building waiting for her mother, who was there to get medicine, aka morphine, to come back downstairs. Sherry was dirty, in ragged clothes, and alone. Miserable. Basically the product of being raised by a junkie whore. This is the first time that Eric meets Sherry in the comics. He had come there to talk to Funboy, but first Eric gives Sherry the engagement ring that he gave Shelley, as he thinks Shelley would want her to have it, and promises to see her again. Eric only meets with her one other time just before he is leaving to see her, as he promised, and apologized to Sherry for all the things that she had been through and all the things she was going to go through. But he honestly believes that things will get better. And that is the extent of their relationship. So as I alluded to earlier, most of what we get on in the film with Sarah was just not in the comics at all. From here, Eric goes straight to Gideon's pawn shop in the film, and things actually went down fairly close to how they did in the comics, save for Gideon being killed by Eric in the comics. One large exception to the comics is that Eric was not a musician like he is in the film and did not take a guitar from Gideon's pawn. In the comics, he takes a duffel bag full of assault rifles because he means some serious shit. As Eric is leaving Gideon's pawn, he meets Officer Albrecht in both the film and the comics. But Eric is still inside Gideon's pawn in the comics. The comics basically make Officer Albrecht out to be a young, inept beat cop that Eric is rather patient with and gets him to deliver a message to Captain Hook that the Crow sends his regards and that this will all be over tomorrow night. As Eric is leaving, he casually tells Albrecht that he has set a bomb in the back of Gideon's pawn shop, and he has about 2 minutes before it goes off. Albrecht gets out of there and calls Captain Hook to give him the message, which obviously doesn't happen in the film because the two characters are one person in Ernie Hudson, and, you know, he'd be calling himself, and, well, fuck, that's just weird. The next thing we see in the comic is Captain Hook sitting at his desk, holding his head in his hands after getting Albrecht's call. Then he pulls Eric and Shelley's homicide case file from the file drawer and throws it away, saying, "Perhaps God has some wisdom after all." I take that to mean a couple of things. Number one, Captain Hook was having to accept a reality that involved a dead guy coming back from the dead for revenge. And while he could not deny it, it still took a minute to swallow that. The next part, throwing away the case file, was Captain Hook essentially removing any evidence. He was helping, basically. In the film, this scene is reworked to have Albrecht have the case file pulled to verify his theory that he had actually talked to Eric Draven. Also, for the record, the whole scene where Eric visits Albrecht at his home is not in the comics and mostly serves just to further cement the amalgamation of the character with Captain Hook. In the movie, Eric goes to see Funboy next, and he finds Sarah's mom, Darla, in bed with Funboy having just shot up morphine. This is essentially how he finds the two of them in the comics, but there are definitely some major changes. One of the big ones is that there is no moral high ground about Sandy, aka Darla, and Funboy doing morphine in the comic. As I mentioned already, Eric himself did morphine in the comics. But what I did not mention was that Eric actually got the morphine from Funboy. Now, in both the comic and in the film, Eric tells Darla that her daughter is out there on the streets waiting for her. And he even tells her that mother is the name for God in the lips and hearts of all children, in both the film and the comic. However, in the comics, though, there was a bit more to it. Eric told her to go from the place before he, Funboy, sucks all the light from your eyes, which I think is important as it shows a genuine concern for her as well and not just judgment like in the film. But the biggest change has to be Eric killing off Funboy right away in the movie, the deaths are similar in both the comics and the film. In the comic, Eric sticks 2 needles with a milliliter with a morphine in them in Funboy's heart. That's about 8 or 9 times the average dose for an adult. And in the movie, it's several needles. But it doesn't specify how much is in each needle. I don't know, you decide. Maybe it was more, maybe it was less, maybe it was the same. However you want to look at it. Also in the comics, Eric lets Funboy go on the grounds that he goes and gathers the others and has them all meet him out at the gym mill. Funboy tries to tell T-Bird about this supernatural killer coming after him, but T-Bird dismisses Funboy as a worthless junkie and doesn't believe any of the supernatural stuff that Funboy says. But he does believe that a man is going around picking off his guys, so T-Bird gathers every soldier that he has and prepares to take out Eric when he comes. The next couple of scenes with Gideon and Top Dollar never happened in the comics. As I mentioned, Gideon was already killed by Eric and never lives long enough to report anything to anybody, and Top Dollar wasn't even remotely interested in what happened to Gideon's pawn shop. Lastly, and this leads to my next point, T-Bird was the last to die in the comics because he was the guy at the top, the one who led the gang that beat, raped, and murdered Shelley. But in the film, he is killed off as an underling of Top Dollar. Also, O'Barr never showed how the Crow actually killed T-Bird in the comic. It's left to the imagination. But even then, things did not go like they did in the comics at all. In the comics, Eric puts a Grand Canyon where Shelby the Giant's head used to be from the roof of T-Bird's car with a shotgun. Then Eric makes T-Bird get out of his car and watch as he single-handedly takes out every single guy that T-Bird had gathered. But not before Eric allows them to shoot the shit out of him in an act of self-inflicted attrition for his deeds while acting at God's hand of vengeance. Using the Samson simile, I would liken this to Samson's time with the Philistines after his hair was cut and they gouged out his eyes. Ultimately, I would even include his killing himself in an act of final vengeance to finish off the Philistines. Seeing Eric take all of that and still wipe out his whole army, T-Bird runs for it and gets back into his car with Shelby the Giant's corpse and takes off out of town. But the Crow flies in front of his windshield just as he is driving on a certain country road outside of Detroit. Then T-Bird looks back behind him and sees the car right on his ass and shouts, "Shit, this is wrong. This is the wrong road. This is where..." And T-Bird crashes and flips his car and it rolls over to its side. T-Bird crawls out of the car and his legs are all busted up pretty bad from the wreck. "Come on, just do it, you pussy. You ain't shit." And this is roughly where it leaves off. Eric is seen approaching T-Bird with a hammer in his hand to do a little Maxwell's Silver Hammer action. If you're not a Beatles fan, you don't get that reference. In Maxwell's Silver Hammer, off the Abbey Road album, Maxwell goes around killing people with his hammer. So that's what that reference is about. Anyway, we never see Eric take out T-Bird. So in this particular case, T-Bird's death was a lot cooler in the movie because, well, at least we got to see something. The scene with Darla actually attempting to reform and bond with her daughter was a nice touch. What happens in the comic is pretty dark and bleak, but the comic does at least point to a possible, hopeful future like this if she did take Eric's advice and go try to be a mother for her child. This was one addition that I really liked. The next scene where Eric is seen at his and Shelley's old apartment, burning their memorabilia by throwing it into the fireplace, is akin to Eric burning down his and Shelley's old apartments in the comics. Just this was things were coming to an end, and he's trying to tie up loose ends. But this is on a much more subtle scale, but I mean, I think that's where they were going with this. In the movie, the next scene is from the comics when Eric shows up to deal with Top Dollar and his guys. But there are some differences. Like, Eric did not show up at Top Dollar's place to kill Skank, and Skank was a much different person in the comics. This was due to his character being an amalgamation of Skank and Tom Tom. But in the comics, Skank was sadistic and cruel, even to the weak and helpless. In fact, he got off on it. Skank also didn't get thrown out of a window. In the comics, Eric straight slices Skank's head off with a katana, which is a way more badass kill, if you ask me. There's also the fact that in the movie, T-Bird reported the death of Tintin to Top Dollar a lot earlier in the film. But it was a guy named Sanchez in the comics doing it, and way earlier in the story. But those things aside, the movie is close enough to what happens in the comics in this scene with a couple of exceptions. As he does during all of his murders, Eric rambled on like a madman in the comics, sometimes speaking nonsense and sometimes speaking the truth, and sometimes even revealing things about himself. But more often than not, they mostly serve to give a kind of wrath of God type of vibe to the killing. Also, Top Dollar gets shot right in the freaking eye and dies at the end of the scene in the comics. So that that part is significantly different than in the film. There's also no team up with Officer Albrecht or Captain Hook, for that matter, at the church. Top Dollar has no creepy sister, so she's not there to tell Top Dollar to kill the crow in order to kill Eric Draven. Therefore, Eric's crow is never killed, and he never loses his powers, if that is even what would happen if the crow died in the comics. We don't know. Nothing like that happened. There's also no final boss fight in the rain on the rooftop, and Eric did not beat Top Dollar by giving him Shelley's pain. But I will say that all of that did serve to make an entertaining movie, even if, in some ways, I think it missed the point. The comic finishes off with Eric sitting at Shelley's grave in the snow. Next to him is his own empty grave. There's an angel statue here in the graveyard, holding its hand up to its chin. "Hello, Shelley," Eric says. "It's over, baby. I'm coming home." Then we see the same angel statue, but now it's got its hands covering its eyes. "Remember when you said mine and I said forever? Only forever, you asked? It's forever now, Shelley." The angel is now down on one knee with its head hung in its hands. The scene makes me believe that Eric had set things right and was accepted into heaven. So now we have reached the final thoughts section of the show. I have heard it said by folks that I respect, that the 1992 film is faithful to the spirit of the film, but I must respectfully disagree. In my opinion, the 1992 film failed to represent Eric Draven in a faithful manner, and in the process lost a big chunk of who he is, what he was doing, and where he will end up. Removing things like the religious overtones and the cutting and drug use all take away from that in a really big way. But don't get me wrong, The Crow is a great movie and I enjoy it a lot. As I mentioned in the opening of the show, it is a goth classic, and rightly so. But I have to recommend that you check out the comic itself to get the whole picture if you want to understand the story and Eric himself. As a film on its own, The Crow is a 5 out of 5, and even has an amazing soundtrack to back it up. But as the comic book adaptation, I feel like they removed the soul of the comic and just kept the deeds alone. So I mean, that's just my take on it. I guess I feel a couple of ways about it. But thank you so much for joining me for another episode of From Comics to Screen. I really appreciate each and every one of you that watches the show. I will see you next time, folks.